All right, we're going to carry those reflections on exile further into a series of reflections on cultural and religious pluralism as a literary frame. And I think this is the moment to say that everything that we've said and heard in these days has had both intellectual resonance and has been deeply moving. It's had an affective presence. I think we've all been stirred to think autobiographically, not out of any vanity, but because there are all of these historical reserves, if you will, anxieties, traumas, exhilarations, reserves of hope that have somehow come into play. And I think that really speaks to the success of this gathering. I really want to thank you, Tom, Pankaj, the Georgetown colleagues, the colleagues from Villa Malta. It's a very unusual, even extraordinary kind of coming together of thoughts. And we are meant to address the question of how writers from the global south, if you will, have other kinds of resources and reserves to draw on than what you might call a certain Western modern trajectory of literary form. I thought I might just annotate and gloss that a little bit by way of the Philippine novelist and nationalist Jose Rizal, who in his 1887 novel, Noli Me Tangere, spoke of the demon of comparisons, the demonio de las comparaciones, by which he meant the double consciousness that people in the colonies, and I would say the post-colonies, have of being anchored both in their local reality and its traditions and its questions, but always with the consciousness of what goes on in the metropole, if you will. And there's a passage in the book where he talks about how he can't look at and experience a garden in Manila without thinking of a garden in Heidelberg, which was also where he lived and practiced. And in that context, I think this binary of the West and the non-West, as we've seen in all of these discussions, is really, I wouldn't say broken down, but has come across under the sign of entanglement much more. And I think that's the reality that all of us live and from which we write and speak our minds, if you will. So in that context, I'm going to really invite you, Camilla, to go first, and then Mohsin.
Thank you, Ranjit. And I think it's a mark of how productive these 2 days have been that I'm not going to say a single thing that I thought I would say prior to the start of this, because so much has come out of these conversations that I find new ideas bouncing up. And what I say actually is going to lead on quite directly from your comments. I've been thinking today about the short story, The First Party, written by Atiya Hussain, who was a writer who grew up in British India and then moved to Britain. And it's a story I love, which is it's a woman from a traditional Indian Muslim family who's married an anglicized Indian man. And he takes her to a party. They're just married. And at this party are anglicized Indian women and English women and men. And the bride is incredibly ill at ease and can't find her way into any conversation. And there's a beautiful moment where she can't understand the conversation about clothes because the women around her are talking about clothes as though they are things that change according to where you are and what time of year it is. And for her, clothes are just about occasion. There are clothes you wear for weddings, clothes you wear for Eid. It's got nothing to do with what year it is or which city you happen to be in. So she's completely alienated from this surrounding in India. And I mentioned that to say it's worth acknowledging how many of us from South Asia who write in English are from the tradition of her husband rather than her. And he's quite embarrassed by her and her insistence on wearing her bridal clothes as are traditional to this. So the question that the sort of blurb posits, which is, have we suppressed, do writers suppress our traditions in order to conform to some norm of the Western novel? I would say, but we have grown up in the Western novel. We've grown up reading the Western novel. And that has formed our idea of what can and should happen in a novel, and may also have created some discomfort with the woman who comes up to a party wearing her bridal clothes because she's recently married. And strangely, it's occurred as I was thinking about this, I realized that if we're talking about Pakistani writers in particular, it's actually the women writers more than the men who are likely to be from this very, very narrow band. And there are all kinds of reasons to do with transgression and writing and gender and what's permissible, which I'm not going to go into now. But it goes back to an earlier conversation, which is the importance of translation, because there are other kind of traditions that have been written. There's a remarkable novel called Angan. It's an Urdu novel by Khatija Mastoor, which Daisy Rockwell has translated into English as The Women's Courtyard. It's coming out by Penguin US later this year. And I was thinking about it, particularly as Eche was speaking, because it's a novel which is set entirely in the women's space of a house. Not because the protagonist, Alia, only lives there. She leaves, she goes, she's educated, she becomes a teacher, she leaves the house, she comes back. But we are to understand that the rules she lives under are the rules of the women's courtyard. And she's so aware at an early age of the power structures that are crushing her and can crush her further, to do with gender, to do with class, to do with all kinds of things, to do with politics. And her decision is to say no and to refuse to be further crushed by these power structures. And the no places her, it alienates her from everyone. This is not a story of empowerment. This is not a story where she goes out and gets the university education and is freed. In fact, her only other female relative who has a university education is a contemptible woman who thinks herself superior to all other women and is in no way a model. And every time she says no to these crushing power structures, in some ways she pulls herself further and further from everyone else. There is no possibility in her world of meeting like-minded people and starting a revolution and it's not that. It is a story of someone who knows she lives in a poisoned world, knows she cannot win, and knows that all the power she has is to say no, even though there's an unhappiness in that. But there would be a further unhappiness, and a different kind and more profound unhappiness in not saying no. You read the novel and you realize it's very hard to imagine this as a novel written and published in the English language. There are all kinds of ways in which it does not conform. The thing we talk about so often the arc of the novel, the arc of the character. It doesn't do that in any of the conventional ways. It is coming to us from some other tradition, some other world. It's also very useful because I do think, to echo Eche, it's interesting and useful to think of a moment of defeat and what you can do within that. Although I'll also say that when I emerge from the novel and I think, today I've emerged from thinking about the novel and thought, I'm so glad I have all of you in defeat. You know, I mean, the novel also does remind you of the ways in which you are not in the novel. But there's another point to be made about the way these kinds of books can get into the world. Daisy Rockwell translated it. It was published by Penguin India in 2018. It didn't come into the world of the UK or the US at that point. And then Daisy Rockwell translated Gitanjali Shree's The Sandwoman, it's called. What is the name of the novel? Tomb of Sand, which won the International Booker's Prize. And then Penguin US said, what else have you got? And she said, well, there's this thing I published. So again, there's a sort of reliance on this sort of particular network of power that goes around the English language centers of publishing. And it might also be useful for those of us who operate within those worlds, to think about something like a Khatija Masoor novel and what Daisy Rockwell did, and what it does, to talk about that novel as well. I mean, it is a wonderful novel. I'm not talking about it because it's good to read in a kind of, betterment for the soul way. It's a wonderful novel. It's a wonderful novel that would have a very hard time finding its way in the world and had to be midwifed by the International Booker Prize and Daisy Rockwell in some way.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I continue with my sense of being deeply moved, because each of these testimonies, I would have to say, brings forth this question of how, in a Rizalian universe, it is the people in the colonies and the post-colonies who have the double consciousness. But the metropole is, I'm being ironic, is quite innocent of that. It doesn't need to know the elsewhere. It also sets me thinking about, in my other life in the visual arts, how often I've come across even South Asians who look at miniature paintings and say, oh, didn't these guys know anything about vanishing point perspective? And you have to say, no, the conventions are different.
Yeah.
Or why is Sanskrit drama so full of cardboard characters? Because it's not about the development of character, but more about this as we go along. Mohsin?
No, it's very interesting. The three of us are all from a kind of, Urdu, Hindi speaking universe in addition to English. And funny things happen with language. Somebody was just telling me the other day that somebody had told them that it was curious that in Urdu and Hindi we have this form, this sort of vowel form. So in English, if you're going to, you want to make something, you make something. And if you want to tell someone to make something, you tell them to make something. And then if you want someone to tell someone else to make something, you say, tell them to make something. But we can just say, banwao, have it made by someone else. There's an entire grammar that sort of presupposes that I won't do the work. You won't do the work. You will tell someone else to do the work that I would like to have done. Now, we can imagine, I think, all sorts of fairly horrifying applications for this grammar and incredible sort of indolence as you sort of, have someone else bring the grape to dangle into your mouth as you lie there on your, your cushion. But it's very interesting, this notion of imagining a thought passing from yourself to someone else for them to perform some action. And it comes, I think, to the idea of how pluralism in a novel can work. Because on the one hand, a novel seems inherently, or written literature, seems inherently poorly designed to be pluralistic. Sort of one person typically writes it, and then one person reads it. And so it's a transmission of one to one. So where does sort of pluralism come into it? Now, on the one hand, we can say, well, pluralism comes because many people are writing. And so if you read across many people, you encounter many different things, and that is the source of pluralism. And that is, of course, correct. Absolutely. But I was just curious about whether more pluralism is even possible within the novel or the written literature form, just in and of itself. And I think, there is a sort of interesting possibility because since it's one writer, if Kamla writes a novel and you read it, a different novel is made than if Kamla writes a novel and I read it. There's something inherently pluralistic about the notion that the novel comes into being across people. And so it suggests, at least to me, it has suggested that this notion that we have in Urdu and Hindi of banwao, have them make it, is also quite close to how I think of writing novels. That have them make it, you, writer, I, have these characters come into existence in the form of what I'm writing, but they're really only coming into existence so somebody else can actually make the novel out of these words. The reader is in fact being suggested through the words of the novel to go and make something. And there's an incredible fertility in that suggestion, because we are not asked to act like this in our regular lives when we grow up very much. It's really only as children when we can sit down, most of us, when we can sit down with somebody else and say, okay, now I'm a princess and like you are a wolf, or like I am a astronaut and you are a space pirate, or whatever it is. And now this is this is going to be the spaceship, and this is going to be, and we imagine that into existence, and we go off and we sort of inhabit that world. And then we grow up, and we're told, look, you're not supposed to really do that anymore. But we still want to do it, actually. We realize that we're making ourselves up as we go along our whole lives. And we invent ourselves each day and each morning, and we come into the world, and I act like Mohsin, and you act like Kamla, and you act like Ranjit, but we're acting slightly differently depending on who we're with. We act differently in this room and differently in some other room. Anyway, so this idea of feeling that we play make-believe, wanting to play make-believe, is very, very strong in us. And the novel and the written literature comes to us as one of the very, very few invitations we have to continue to do this, where you can sit there and you, the reader, may imagine that the writer is making the thing. But the writer hasn't actually made the thing. The writer has basically made the invitation. And you, the reader, are going to then take that invitation and make the thing. The writer has told you to go do the work, in a sense. And the writer has done a certain degree of work so that the invitation is such that it is an invitation that appeals to you enough for you to do the work. But that is sort of what is going on. And so, when I think of pluralism and literature, and I completely agree with the notion of reading across cultures, reading across time, reading across backgrounds, all of these things. But I'm actually also very encouraged by the fact that we can play make-believe with people very different from ourselves, many of whom are no longer even alive. And that make-believe that we are doing is actually quite pluralistic. So when we read someone and we make this novel come alive in our minds, we are making something the world has never seen before. You, this particular reader, have never read this particular book, and therefore you have never made it. It was just a bunch of words until it came to you. And so I think that this capacity is one that is enormously attractive. And so I would, I guess, just say that there are at least two dimensions of what we're talking about here. One is the limitation of a book being written by a single person, which, and then if that single person is one of a particular group of people who's the only group allowed to write books, it has its own limitations. And that's a very limiting thing. But on the other hand, the fact that books can be read by anyone and the reading makes the book actually makes I think, literature a remarkably pluralistic form. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we exist in a quite beautiful tension between this highly individualized and possibly siloed and overly circumscribed group of authors, and this infinite number of combinations, this infinite number of children who can be born from the coming together of a pair of writers and a pair of writer and reader.
Thank you, Mohsin. Many questions arising out of this, but I'm going to loop back to you, Kamala. As you were speaking, it came to me that, especially when you dwelt on Angan, I was also thinking of Ismat Chughtai, thinking of a whole range of specifically women writers of a certain period and generation in South Asia. And to link that thought to the theme of revolution that has come up, how would you parse the possibilities of, let's say, feminist poetics coming out of some of these authors? Because the definitions of freedom, of volition, of desire are different. They're differently mapped. They're differently contained. Are we talking about the same thing when we think about feminist poetics in South Asia, for instance, as against elsewhere?
I mean, I think
And that's a large question. But
it is, and I think it's also necessary to mention whether you're talking about more recently Femida Riaz or Atiya Daud or go back to Ismet Chughtai or Khatija Masood, they were all also reading English literature and were very influenced by it. So I don't in any way wish to suggest that these are two entirely separate traditions. It's just sort of interesting that they took what they were reading in English and moved it into a different language with a different audience. And something happens as a result of that. I mean, I don't think there's even a singular feminist poetic, and I think it's, the Femida Riaz, it's very much a response to General Zia's Pakistan. And Khatija Masood and Ismet Chughtai, they're modernists, and for them it is about partition and independence and that great, the doubleness of this. It's the most horrific thing, partition, and yet it's independence, and the sort of duality they're living in. So it is a different feminist poetic, but it's not a disconnected feminist poetic, I would say. I was also thinking as Mohsin was speaking, because I'm aware that I've been doing a lot of sitting here talking about defeat and things like that. I was thinking about one of the things that I love about the novel, and there is something I'm not quite reaching, but I'm going to just say this, and it might throw some suggestion into the air of an idea. What I love about a novel is the way in which it rewards, or it leaves space for both familiarity and estrangement as a point of entry. This is, I think, what makes the form so extraordinary. So in Mohsin is talking about all the different readers that can come to it. If Mohsin is reading me, and I'm writing about Pakistan in the 1980s, a lot of it Mohsin is coming to from familiarity. Whereas if Naomi is reading it, she's going to read it in a different way because she was not in Pakistan in the 1980s, and it will be about a kind of discovery. And of course, Naomi will find things that are familiar, and Mohsin will find things that are absolutely not. But there is something in the capaciousness of the form. And also, when we speak about who is the audience, I loathe that question. I think there's a very significant question of what is the literary culture that decides whether this can be published, whether this can be rewarded, whether this can be reviewed. And I think it's really necessary to separate that from who is the audience. And I say that with such vim, because when I grew up in Pakistan reading and loving the English language novel, I was no one's intended audience. I was no one's intended audience, and that did nothing to come between me and the novels that I loved. It didn't disrupt our intimacy. And I remember being about 12 years old and picking up a book that told me that C.S. Lewis's Narnia books were about Christianity and that Aslan was Christ. And I remember thinking, well, if some people need him to be that, that's fine. For me, he's an amazing magical lion. And that literature has, that's another form, the plurality of it. It's related to what Mohsin said, it's the expansiveness of the form. And that doesn't mean it's absolutely open-ended. There are such things as bad readings of a book. I want to be very clear about this. And I know this because some of my books have had very bad readings where you think, you brought in all kind of stuff that just isn't there. And there are other times I had someone interpret for me the end of one of my novels, and I realized that she was right, and that my own idea of what the end of my novel meant was very inferior to hers, and that, I now need to change how I think about it. So I think that the openness and capaciousness and the multiplicity of ways. And it's useful for a group of people from such different places to think about the multiplicity of ways in which you can approach a subject, and that estrangement is often as fruitful. Estrangement is the right word. Unfamiliarity is often as fruitful, if not more fruitful, than familiarity.
Completely agree. It's telepathic. I made a note for a question to Mawson, which literally says location and capaciousness. But also I really warm to this theme of the figure of the unpredictable or the unintended reader, because likewise, I think this question of who the audience is, how is the audience predefined, those are not productive. It's really in one sense, the leap of faith that is made here between writer and reader. Mawson, I want to turn to you with that thought. After a certain point, you've stopped really referring to where your novels are located. I mean, it's clear to some people, may not be that clear to others, but there's this push-pull between the granularity of location, your own predicament, and reaching out to other predicaments elsewhere. It's a kind of a roundabout and more useful way of approaching what might be universal. Do you want to address that?
Yeah, I mean, just one thing on what Kamala was saying before we move on to what you just raised, Ranjit. I think, a novel is like a love letter. You sort of put it into the world, but you're not quite sure who the love letter is to, or when they're going to receive it. But the hope, of course, is that somebody receives this love letter and opens it, and in a way falls in love. And for me, that gesture is such an interesting gesture for human beings to spend time making. Why do you sit there for hours a day in a room for years? What are you doing? But I think, this notion of putting this thing into the world really as a kind of romantic gesture for someone to participate with you in this imaginative project, and then hoping that they will. And it's quite interesting because very rarely do we love in that way. We are often very specific and very intentionally curtailing in how we love, right? Like, I will only love you, or I will only love this. But when you put a novel into the world, you're sort of being a little, by necessity, more open with that feeling. Like
polyamorous.
Yes, you're being a little, absolutely, very much so. And that gesture, which is then received by the reader, by some readers, hopefully, and the reader feels something. And the books that we love, in a sense, when we think about the books we love, we often tend to forget how well those books love us back. The books that you love the most, you imagine it's this one-sided relationship where, you are in love with this book. But in fact, the book was made, to also sort of fall in love with you. And you're discovering that when you read the book. Now, to sort of your point, and in terms of, how does one build books, and sort of what I've done with books, we've been talking on, in the last couple of days about, self-exoticization and self-orientalism. And so when I moved back to Pakistan after my second book, I wanted to write a book that didn't use the word Pakistan and didn't use the word Islam and didn't use any really proper nouns except for continent names. And in fact, it was a novel that was disguised as a self-help book on how to get filthy rich, because, as Nasreen said, that's what all the kids sort of want to read now. Everybody wants to read books in Pakistan and Kenya about how do you get ahead in life. So the novel was sort of pretending to be one of those books, a bit of a, just as a play with the idea of what are books for. But I thought, partly I was curious what happens if you don't name things and you leave lots of spaces and lots of gaps into which the reader can place things. Yep. Does that make your love letter more more loving, or less. Who knows? But for me, it was an interesting exploration, which is that would a reader come to this, without place, without names, etc., read it and still feel that they've made this thing? Would they want to do that? And so I went through this exercise, and I've kind of become attracted to it and have done similar things in a number of subsequent books. I think that this idea of the universal is very interesting to me. And the idea that the universal paradoxically can be found everywhere. Yeah. What's troubling about the universal is when we claim that the universal is found in a particular place. But when we imagine that the universal is found everywhere, suddenly the universal, ceases to be as problematic, or some might say ceases to be universal. But for me, that was very interesting. Could I take, for example, Lahore and just talk about what it is like to live through a life and all these sorts of things? But I wanted to sort of come back to what Kamla was saying with a short story. I had a very interesting experience as a reader recently, because every spring, the last few years, I've been volunteering at a local university in Lahore. And there I co-teach this class. And I've never taught before. I've never had a paid teaching job. I still don't have a paid teaching job. I just sort of show up for a few classes every semester. And in exchange, I don't have to have a work email or do any grading. I just sort of show up and teach, co-teach. And in this class, interestingly enough, this year, we happened to have 15 young women and 1 young man. And in some ways, you would think, as by far the oldest person in the room, my co-teacher is at least a decade younger than me, and the students are much less than half my age. And as a man, in a way, you could say, oh, well, my starting point, generationally and gender and so many other terms, is very far removed from many of my students. I'm sure all writers feel like this, and if you live in different countries and teach people in different places, it must be even more. But anyway, what I wanted to say was, I found it so interesting to watch them hear me trying to explain how I was reading their stuff. Everybody, I mean, the other students also explained, and the other teacher, but I was also watching when I was doing it. And it made me aware of, for the writer, this notion of how might I be read? Mm-hmm. What are you seeing in this? What are you reacting to? How are you doing it? Is such an incredibly potent and beautiful thing. Most of us, when we're writing, we just sort of send it into the world, and we don't really encounter the readers in real time. At least I don't very much, except in, when you go to give a talk or something. But in these classrooms, the teachers are talking, the students are talking, everybody's talking. And I actually felt, in a sense, I would leave this classroom so much more a Lahori or a Pakistani than I came in. Because I would get these stories of these lives of these young people, which are very different from how I grew up, and very different in their backgrounds. And so I suppose what I guess I'm trying to say is that I, as a writer who is not professionally a reader, in this case had to be professionally a reader in a way. I mean, Kamla has taught much more than me, and she can say much more about this than I can. But I felt made more pluralistic by the experience of reading these other writers and talking to them about what they wrote. And that I thought was very powerful for me personally.
I'm just going to jump to say one thing, that for all we've been saying about the capaciousness of the novel, I think it's also important to acknowledge, and this is sort of follows on from Mohsin, that many novels, in many kinds of ways, will often rely on a certain knowledge that the reader brings about social cues and context and assumptions and subtext. There's there are particularly a novel of social satire. You need to know the society that's being satirized. You need to know the in-joke. You need to know what is not being said and what is being connoted or denoted. And that, of course, is very reliant on a local readership. And as a result, there are certain kinds of novels that if I am to write that kind of social satire of Karachi, it's going to be inexplicable to a lot of readers from other parts of the world. So it's not true that every novel has the universal. There are some novels that are written in a way that are really reliant on, and with the English language novel, we know how to read Jane Austen, even if we're in Pakistan. But there's a lot of training. There's a whole world involved in teaching everyone around the world how to read and understand the world of Jane Austen and know the subtext.
Actually, it's true. I mean, English literature as a subject was invented for the colonies.
Yeah.
And our teachers would always explain it to us. This is what's happening. This
Yeah.
is what's happening.
Yeah.
Here's what it means.
Yeah.
But we've reached the point for the Q&A. I have another question, but I'll loop back into this bit. Pankaj? Oh.
Now, I just want to follow on from something Kamla said and Mohsin said, bringing these two things together, perhaps. The invitation to the reader, and then, of course, the literary culture, the all-important question of what literary culture are you operating it in at any given time. So, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that the invitation can be extended, but it can also be declined. It can also be ignored if the time is not right. I'm thinking of, as you were speaking, I'm thinking of two instances of an attempt, two very different writers, to describe, let's say, the reality of pluralist societies. So one example is from the 1930s, Kantapura. Raja Rao, one of the first sort of Indian novelists in English, pioneering one, trying to describe a South Indian village as it prepares for the arrival of the nationalist movement in it. And, the attempt is not entirely successful, and, I don't think the novel was widely read. It remains a canonical novel. But the invitation was not taken because, there were hardly any readers interested at that point in reading about a South Indian village. Fast forward to early 2000s, and there's a book about a Kashmiri village, Salman Rushdie, Shalimar the Clown, where the attempt, it's a similar attempt, let's describe the pluralist nature of Kashmiri society. Now, the novel goes out into the world, it's received as a great document of multiculturalism and pluralism, but when you actually look at the pluralism that is being described there, you notice that it's very much in line with a certain Indian notion of pluralism, which is that the Hindus basically define what is plural, and the Muslims basically accept that. So you have Muslims joining Indian Hindu festivals. There's no instance in the novel of Hindus joining Muslim festivals. So what it turns into is a sort of a novel replicating a certain ideology of Indian secularism or Indian pluralism. But there are no readers, really, who can see this very clearly. So the invitation is again being accepted widely. The novel is a bestseller. But again, to go back to your question of this familiarity, unfamiliarity, there's a sort of disconnect there because the literary cultures in which we are operating, and Zeri said something about, yesterday about constantly talking about the question of religion and faith in her writing. But again, that invitation is not being taken up by any of the critics to examine that. I also mentioned, the role religion plays in the fiction of some of the most canonical English writers in the first half of the 20th century, from Isherwood, Somerset Maugham, just any number of Ian Forster.
Actually.
And yet, where are the critics who can accept that invitation? Even today, you have biographies coming out of some of these figures, and the biographers skate over those episodes, which are potentially probably formative episodes for some of these writers at least. So there is still that question of the invitation is extended, but it's depending on the literary culture. It can be declined, can be dismissed, or it can be misinterpreted.
Would you like to respond?
Yes. I mean, I think I think it's a very useful reminder. I mean, it's much more. Everything gets more complicated. So we'll sit here and we'll say the novel is capacious, but people are problematic, and the power structures are the power structures. The novel is still operating within that. And there is the question of what how to. There's Natasha Brown's Assembly. There's something very interesting that happens in that book. It proceeds along. It's large. It's a sort of not quite a social satire, but it's successful black woman in Britain gets involved with upper class white man and their encounters and her encounters with the family. And then suddenly near the end, the book stops. And there's an essay. And there's an essay on race and blackness. And what is this doing? And the first time I read it, I thought, I have no idea what's going on. And I thought, I think what she's doing is saying, listen, to really understand what I'm talking about here, you need to understand all this stuff that my character knows. And you, reader, may not know it. So I'm now going to set it out. And then we'll return to the novel. And it seems to be sort of interesting acknowledgement of the problem of writing lives that, we haven't been taught in the way we've been taught Jane Austen. Yeah.
It also sounds like a certain kind of 18th century novel, which loops in and out of narrative and discursiveness. But Gabriel, you had a question.
Yes, thank you. I would just like to add something else to the discussion about pluralism. Because I was thinking that what we're talking about when we talk about the relationship between fiction and pluralism is also this. It's not only lost in this the relationship between the one writer and the one reader who gets the love letter. It's also, we're talking also about this strange inability the language of fiction has to take sides, or rather the language of fiction's strange disposition to include different views of the world at the same time, different systems of values, different and opposite truths. This is what a Catalan critic, Jordi Gracia, discussing Cervantes, called the conquest of irony. I think it's a beautiful idea. The opening of a space in which a truth and its contrary can be sustained at the same time. If Javier Cercas was still here, he would say, yes, Cervantes, what is Don Quixote? Is he crazy as hell or the only sane man in the whole of Spain? Both at the same time. There's a beautiful essay that nobody reads anymore that Ford Madox Ford wrote on a boat traveling to Marseille from, I can't remember where. It's called History of the English Novel from Beowulf to the Death of Joseph Conrad. And in that little book, he says that what the novel discovered at a certain point in its evolution was the ability to become a many-sided discussion of the human case. I love every word in that idea. It's the humanity treated as a mystery, right? The human case, but also the many-sided discussion, meaning that the novel approaches its subjects from everywhere, and it's able to sustain and defend different systems of values, and it's up to the reader to explore them, bring his or her own experience into the thing. But the novel then opens a space in which we suspend judgment. We don't judge anymore, we strive to understand. And that is also what we mean by pluralism. It's just that.
Yes, and.
I love and.
Yes, and. Well, why say but? It's so unfriendly. Yes, and that is a decision that a writer can make or not make, which is, will I write a novel in a way that these different viewpoints are given equal space? You know, when Toni Morrison writes Beloved, I know whose side she's on. And Toni Morrison is very clear, I will not represent the white point of view. That is also a decision that she makes knowingly, and the novels are no less for it. So I think sometimes we might need to acknowledge as writers how much of an agenda we also have and how much we push towards one interpretation or not. And it's also true that when I'm writing a novel, I'm a better person than when I'm not, because when I'm writing a character who, if I met that kind of person in real life, I would dismiss them in a second. And as a novelist, it becomes really interesting for me to see the world through their eyes and to present it and, all of that. So it's not a disagreement, but it is to say it is a decision. Whether we take that view of here are the opposing points of views and the contradictory characters, or really, really not. Right?
It's
And yes.
I was just thinking very briefly about one of the last novels Mario Vargas Llosa wrote. It's called in Spanish Tiempos Recios, maybe Harsh Times in English, I don't know the translation. This was written at a moment in which Vargas Llosa had publicly assumed right-wing positions constantly. But the novel tells of a particular moment in Guatemalan history, and what the Vargas Llosa novels becomes is a very strong denunciation of anti-communist paranoia in the 50s, in which every line seems to be a contradiction of what he was publicly sustaining in his op-eds.
Yeah.
So I guess it depends on the kind of world, right?
Yeah.
We are narrating. I'll shut up.
No, but thank you. Parul, did you have a question? Or an observation?
I've been listening with such interest over the last day, and I think that obviously, given what I do, I'm very attentive to the calls to the critic. Where is the critic? And this, so to speak for my own benighted, the two of us sitting here at the back. But as I've been listening to it and trying to understand and being very moved by the fact that, we often speak of writer and reader, but in reality, we need fiction, and the novel needs this huge infrastructure of people, right? It needs it needs a Daisy Rockwell to translate. It needs someone to say, to ask, does she have something else? It needs the critic who can take the time and be paid well enough to spend time doing the work of other forms of translation, to really help bring a book and sort of free the writer in a way from having to do all that contextualization as you're doing your own work. So I don't know, maybe what I'm saying falls more into a comment than a question. But maybe I'm curious about how we nourish some of those other, nourish that kind of work in the world. How can we work alongside each other to do this?
Yeah, it's essential. And it has been a thing that, I'm much more aware of the UK culture, that it has fallen away so much. The spaces for reviews have fallen away. The attention for that kind of criticism, I think, has fallen away. And also, there's a question of who is in those positions, and it's a very basic thing. Like in Britain, publishing is very low paid. There's often assumption that if you're going to enter publishing, that a lot of people will be getting financial help from a family. You will certainly not be expected to financially provide for other people. And then there are certain demographics around the people who enter it. And I would like to see governments care more for the arts. And not to say that they should be telling the arts what to do, but within the UK, we have the Arts Council of England, which distributes a lot of money to arts organization, and that has come under huge pressure in the last few years. Under the Tory government, it also came under political pressure for the kinds of things it was giving money to. They don't know what their next tranche of money is going to look like. And there is, if we look at Ireland, it's very instructive to look at, we talk about the flourishing of literature in Ireland. There's a huge amount of money and infrastructure as well being put into it. As a Pakistani, I hate saying we need to rely on the government, but the government can play a significant role, and the governments of countries like the UK are choosing to withdraw from that role, and that's a large part of the problem we're facing, I think.
I think the cultural sort of context of critics and people talking about books and thinking about books and conversations about books is something we've all grown up with and incredibly important and valuable. In Lahore, when I watch younger people read and sort of how they find what they read, and I have a small sample. My daughter is a fairly voracious reader, and some of the students that I encounter are fairly voracious. Some of the small literary magazines that are popping up have people who read a lot. And so I talk to them, how do you find stuff, and how do you discuss stuff, and how do you know what's good, and how do you know what isn't good? It's very interesting. First of all, the review ecosystem around the world has diminished so much, the sort of paid reviewer ecosystem. Many of us who were published a quarter century ago remember coming out and having 100 reviews, and now there's probably not even 100 paid reviewers in the English-speaking world, maybe, for all we know. But what's happening instead, it seems to be a kind of microcosm of little mini ecosystems of people talking about books. And so one thing that I'm always surprised by when we go to a bookstore with my daughter when we're traveling abroad is the books that she picks. They're from all over the world. They're very weird. 9 times out of 10, I've not heard of the writer before. And I sort of think, what is this thing? I look at the back and I open it and I start flipping through, and it's like some really good book. I'm thinking, how on earth did you, find out about this? And it's like, oh, well, it was on Book Talk, or, my friend read it on whatever. I think what we're seeing is the evolution of some new stuff. It has not yet, as far as I can tell, reached the kind of richness and complexity of maybe what we would hope for. But that said, I've been to the launch of multiple new literary magazines in Lahore in the last few years. I've come across lots of teenagers reading very interesting books from all over the world. And when I've sat down to talk to them, they are clearly getting a way of talking about these books that's informed by some people who are reading, critically very well. So on the one hand, I think I'm a believer in what you've just said, Parul, which is the importance of the critic. It also seems obvious to me that as Kamala said, that the paid critic is a position that seems to be disappearing. And yet, I wonder if the culture isn't in the process of generating something, because there's a need for this. There's a need for people to read books, recommend books, describe books, discuss books. And I'm wondering, I don't know the answer. I wish my daughter was here. We could put her on stage and tell her to give us her answer. Something is happening. And in some ways, these young people are reading a much more pluralistic sense of series of books than anything that I encountered in my teens or early 20s, I have to say.
Do we have time for one last question?
Or not.
Before we get the stop sign. No, I just want to say that that's a wonderful theme to go out on, speaking of love letters to readers and the unpredictable reader. Mohsin, thank you for bringing us to the edge of a new generation with its preferences, its modes of critical mediation, and a note of hope, quite frankly, because it also speaks of, whilst the larger structures and institutions might be collapsing, this speaks to some kind of drive towards self-organization, which I am romantic enough to invest some hope in. But thank you so much, both of you, for being so generous with your insights. Thank you all.